On a cold morning in October 1944, a psychiatrist stood with nothing, not even his clothes, in a room in Auschwitz. Everything had been taken from him. His clothes. His wedding ring. The manuscript he had spent years writing, sewn into the lining of his coat. His wife was somewhere in another camp. His mother and brother had already been killed. He was a number now, 119,104, tattooed on his forearm, standing in a line of men who had been stripped of every external marker of identity that a human being accumulates over a lifetime. And in that moment, standing in the cold with nothing left, Viktor Frankl made a discovery that would change the way the world understood the human mind. He realized that there was one thing the camp could not take from him. One thing that no system of dehumanization, however thorough, however brutal, however total, could reach. The freedom to choose how he responded to what was happening to him. Not the freedom to leave. Not the freedom to eat or sleep or speak without permission. But the last, irreducible, unconfiscatable freedom of a conscious mind, to decide what meaning to give to its own suffering. That discovery, made in the worst place in the history of the 20th century, became the foundation of one of the most important philosophical and psychological frameworks of modern times. And it begins, as all the most important ideas do, not in a library, but in the middle of an experience that should have made thought impossible. Existentialism as a philosophical tradition did not begin with Frankl. It emerged from a long lineage of thinkers who shared a single, radical starting point, that human existence cannot be explained by appealing to a predetermined essence, a divine plan, or a universal human nature that tells each person in advance what they are and what they are for. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, writing in the 19th century, was the first to insist that the most important questions in philosophy were not abstract questions about the nature of reality but concrete questions about how a single human being should live. Friedrich Nietzsche, whose work on Amor Fati appears earlier in this series, pushed further, declaring that the old frameworks of meaning, the religious and metaphysical structures that had told people what their lives were for, were collapsing, and that human beings would have to build new ones from the ground up or be destroyed by the void. In the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre gave the movement its defining formula: existence precedes essence. You exist first. What you are is determined afterward, by the choices you make. There is no human nature that dictates your purpose. There is no God who assigned you a role. There is only the fact of your existence and the absolute, terrifying, inescapable freedom to decide what to do with it. This is the idea that most people find either liberating or unbearable, depending on their temperament. If there is no predetermined meaning, then nothing is decided for you. Every choice is genuinely yours. Every direction is genuinely possible. But if nothing is decided for you, then there is also no one to blame when things go wrong, no structure to fall back on when the weight of existence becomes too heavy, no answer to the question that arrives at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come and the future looks empty. What is any of this for? Sartre called this experience anguish, the specific dread that comes from recognizing that you are free, completely free, and that your freedom is not a gift but a responsibility from which there is no escape. Camus called it the absurd, the collision between the human hunger for meaning and the universe's complete indifference to that hunger. And both of them, in their different ways, insisted that the only honest response to this condition was to face it without flinching, to refuse the comfort of false certainties, and to live anyway. Viktor Emil Frankl was born on March 26, 1905, in Vienna, Austria, into a Jewish family of civil servants. From an early age, he was drawn to the questions that existentialism would later formalize, questions about meaning, about the relationship between suffering and growth, about what distinguishes a life that is merely endured from a life that is genuinely lived. He began corresponding with Sigmund Freud at the age of 16, and Freud was sufficiently impressed that he arranged for one of the young Frankl's papers to be published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He later studied with Alfred Adler, another founding figure of modern psychology, before developing his own ideas that diverged from both Freud and Adler in a fundamental way. Where Freud believed that human behavior was driven primarily by the search for pleasure and the avoidance of pain, and where Adler believed it was driven by the search for power and superiority, Frankl argued that the primary motivating force in human life was the search for meaning. Not pleasure. Not power. Meaning. And the absence of meaning, what he called the existential vacuum, was, he believed, the central psychological crisis of the modern age. He developed a therapeutic approach he called logotherapy, from the Greek logos, meaning. Where traditional psychotherapy looked backward, excavating the past for the roots of present suffering, logotherapy looked forward, toward the future, toward the meaning that the patient had not yet found but was capable of creating. Frankl believed that meaning could be found in 3 ways: through what we give to the world, through work, through creation, through contribution. Through what we receive from the world, through love, through beauty, through connection. And through the attitude we choose to take towards suffering that we cannot avoid. This third path, the meaning found not despite suffering but within it, was the idea that would be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. In September 1942, Frankl, his wife Tilly, his parents, and his brother were deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. Frankl had spent years developing his ideas about meaning and suffering in the relatively safe environment of a Viennese psychiatric clinic. Now those ideas would be tested in conditions that he could not have imagined. His father did not survive Theresienstadt. In 1944, Frankl and the remaining members of his family were transported to Auschwitz. His mother did not survive the first days. His brother never made it out of the camps. His wife Tilly was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she was lost in the final months of the war, weeks before the camp's liberation. Frankl spent time in 4 camps in total: Auschwitz, Kaufering, Turkium, and Dachau, before being liberated by American forces on April 27, 1945. He was 40 years old. He had lost almost everyone he loved. What Frankl observed in the camps, as a prisoner but also, unavoidably, as a psychiatrist, was that survival was not simply a function of physical strength or luck, though both of those things mattered. It was also, and sometimes decisively, a function of meaning. The prisoners who had a reason to survive, a person waiting for them, a work unfinished, a purpose not yet fulfilled, endured conditions that destroyed others who were physically stronger. Those who lost their sense of meaning, who could not find or construct a reason to keep going, often died not from physical causes but from a kind of internal collapse, a surrender to meaninglessness that expressed itself in the body as surely as disease. Frankl watched men give away their last piece of bread and lose their will to live entirely. He watched others, skeletal and frostbitten, maintain a dignity and even a humor that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the reach of what was being done to their bodies. And he began to understand, with the precision of a trained clinician and the urgency of a man fighting for his own survival, what made the difference. The moment that crystallized everything happened during a pre-dawn march through frozen fields, on the way to a work site. The prisoners shuffled in the darkness, guards shouting, the cold so severe that the men moved in a half-conscious stupor of pain and exhaustion. Frankl found himself thinking about his wife. He did not know where she was. He did not know if she was alive. But the image of her face appeared to him with such vividness that it stopped the experience of the march. Not physically, he kept walking, but internally, the suffering was somehow contained by the presence of that love, even as a memory, even as a hope, even as something that might no longer exist in the world outside his mind. He understood in that moment what he had been theorizing for years. Love is not just an emotion. It is a form of meaning-making. The person who loves has a reason to endure. And the reason to endure is, in extremis, the difference between life and death. He also observed, in himself and in others, the phenomenon that he would later describe as the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward unavoidable suffering. The guards could control everything about the prisoners' lives except this. They could take the food, the warmth, the dignity, the future. They could not take the capacity of a conscious mind to step back from its own experience and decide what that experience meant. Frankl called this capacity the defiant power of the human spirit, the ability to say, even in the worst circumstances, even when nothing can be changed, I choose how I face this. I choose what meaning to give it. I choose who I am in relation to what is happening to me. This is not optimism. It is not the pretense that things are better than they are. It is something harder and more honest than optimism, the refusal to be defined by suffering, even while fully acknowledging the reality of that suffering. Tragic optimism, as he would later name it, the ability to say yes to life in spite of everything, not by denying the tragedy but by finding, within it, something worth holding on to. After liberation, Frankl returned to Vienna. He learned, one by one, that almost everyone he had loved was gone. He was alone in the city where he had been born, in an apartment that belonged to a vanished life, with a mind full of ideas that had been tested in fire and had not broken. He sat down and, in 9 days, dictated the book that would eventually be published in English as Man's Search for Meaning. It was not a triumphant book. It was not a book that claimed that everything happens for a reason or that suffering is secretly a blessing. It was a precise, clear-eyed account of what he had observed and experienced, and what he had concluded from that observation, that meaning is not found, it is created, and that the capacity to create it is available to every human being regardless of circumstance. The book has since sold more than 16 million copies in over 50 languages. It has been listed by the United States Library of Congress as one of the 10 most influential books ever written in America, despite being written by an Austrian in German. Frankl went on to rebuild his career with a speed and completeness that itself seemed like a demonstration of his philosophy. He was appointed head of the Vienna Polyclinic of Neurology. He earned a second doctorate in philosophy. He lectured at universities across the world, eventually holding guest professorships at Harvard, Stanford, and Duquesne. He wrote 39 books. He learned to fly a plane at the age of 67. He climbed a mountain in the Austrian Alps at 80. He died in Vienna on September 2, 1997, at the age of 92, having spent more than 5 decades teaching the world what he had learned in the camps, not as a trauma survivor processing his experience, but as a philosopher who had been given the most brutal possible opportunity to test whether his ideas were true, and had found that they were. The existentialist tradition that Frankl inherited and transformed insists on a truth that is deeply uncomfortable and deeply liberating in equal measure, that the absence of predetermined meaning is not a tragedy but an opportunity. The universe does not tell you what your life is for. This is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Because the life that you build from the ground up, the meaning that you create out of the specific materials of your specific existence, your suffering, your love, your work, your choices, is more genuinely yours than any meaning that could have been handed to you. Frankl did not choose Auschwitz. He did not choose the loss of his family. He did not choose the manuscript that was taken from him, or the years that were taken from him, or the future that was taken from him. But he chose what to do with what remained. And what remained, it turned out, was enough to build something extraordinary. The question that existentialism puts to every person who encounters it is simple and impossible and unavoidable: what are you doing with your freedom? Not the freedom to go where you want or buy what you want or say what you want, those freedoms matter, but they are not the freedom Frankl is talking about. He is talking about the deeper freedom, the one that cannot be legislated or imprisoned or taken by force. The freedom to decide what your life means. The freedom to choose, in the face of whatever you cannot change, who you are going to be. Frankl proved, in the hardest laboratory in history, that this freedom is real. That it survives everything. That it is, in the end, the only thing that does.